The night I boarded Flight 913, I thought it would be just another routine trip from Chicago to Seattle. I arrived at the airport exhausted after a long week of work and barely paid attention to the people around me. The gate was unusually quiet, and the boarding process seemed strangely rushed. As I stepped onto the plane, the flight attendant smiled politely but looked nervous, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. I found my seat in row 18 beside the window. Most of the passengers were already seated, quietly scrolling through their phones or staring out the windows. Everything looked completely normal until I noticed the man sitting alone in the very last row. He wore an old black suit that looked decades out of date, and unlike everyone else, he never moved. He simply stared straight ahead without blinking. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, I glanced back once more. The man was still sitting perfectly still. Even stranger, no one else seemed to notice him. During the safety demonstration, every passenger looked toward the flight attendants except him. He never turned his head. The engines roared, and soon we were climbing into the night sky. About 30 minutes into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed. Most passengers settled into sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every time I looked toward the back of the cabin, the man seemed to be staring directly at me, even though he had never physically turned his head. Curiosity finally got the better of me. I walked toward the rear galley to stretch my legs and asked one of the flight attendants if the man in the last row was okay, because he hadn't moved since boarding. She looked confused and asked, "Which passenger?" I pointed toward the last row. Her smile disappeared for a moment before she quietly replied, "Sir, that seat is empty." I laughed, assuming she was joking, but when I looked again, the man was still sitting there exactly where I'd seen him all night. I turned back to the flight attendant, but she looked genuinely frightened. "Please return to your seat," she whispered before quickly walking away. When I sat back down, I tried convincing myself I was simply tired. Then the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they were expecting a little turbulence. Almost immediately, the aircraft shook violently. Overhead bins rattled, drinks spilled, and nervous whispers filled the cabin. As everyone focused on the turbulence, I looked toward the back again. The man hadn't moved at all. While every other passenger gripped their armrests in fear, he remained perfectly still, almost like a statue. Then, for the first time, he slowly smiled. The turbulence ended as suddenly as it had begun. A strange calm settled over the cabin, but something felt wrong. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a cold breeze drifted through the aisle even though the cabin doors were sealed. A child sitting across from me suddenly pointed toward the back and asked his mother, "Why is that man standing now?" His mother looked behind her for only a second before pulling the child close and saying, "There's nobody there." My heart raced because I could clearly see the man standing at the end of the aisle, staring directly at me. Unable to ignore it any longer, I pulled out my phone and secretly took a photo of the back of the plane. When I zoomed in on the image, my stomach dropped. The last row was completely empty. The seats where the man had been sitting showed nothing but darkness. Yet with my own eyes, I could still see him standing there. Before I could take another picture, every screen on the aircraft suddenly went black. The entertainment system shut off. Even my phone froze for several seconds before displaying one line of text that I had never typed. He was never supposed to board. Confused and frightened, I called another flight attendant and quietly showed her my phone. Her face instantly turned pale. She asked where I'd seen those words, but before I could answer, she grabbed my phone and quickly deleted the message. She leaned close and whispered, "Don't mention the last row to anyone." Before I could ask why, she hurried away toward the cockpit. A few moments later, I noticed two crew members standing together, nervously looking toward the rear of the aircraft, as though they could sense something but refused to acknowledge it. A few minutes later, the captain made another announcement. His voice sounded strained, almost shaky. He apologized for a technical issue and said they would be making an unscheduled landing due to a systems malfunction. As the plane slowly descended, the cabin lights flickered several times. During one brief blackout, I heard footsteps moving down the aisle. When the lights returned, the mysterious man was standing only a few rows away from me. Nobody reacted. Nobody screamed. It was as if I was the only person who could actually see him. The aircraft landed safely at a small airport I had never heard of before. Through the window, I expected to see emergency vehicles or airport staff waiting for us, but the runway was completely empty. The plane rolled to a stop, yet the doors remained closed. After nearly 20 minutes, the captain finally spoke again, apologizing for the delay. While everyone remained seated, I looked toward the last row one more time. The man was gone. Relieved, I stood to stretch my legs, but then I noticed something carved into the plastic window beside my seat. It hadn't been there before. 4 words were scratched into the surface. "Don't leave the plane." Ignoring the warning, several passengers began complaining loudly. Eventually, the cabin doors opened, and everyone started gathering their bags. As I stepped into the aisle, I noticed the last row for the first time. Seat 34F didn't have a passenger. It didn't even have a seatbelt. It looked old, dusty, and untouched for years. Curious, I asked another flight attendant why the seat looked different. She stared at me silently before asking, "Sir, how do you know that seat number?" My heart skipped a beat because I had never actually looked at the seat number before. Inside the terminal, airport police quietly questioned every passenger one by one. When it was my turn, an officer asked a strange question. "Did you speak to anyone in the last row?" I hesitated before admitting I'd seen a man sitting there during the flight. The officer exchanged nervous glances with another detective and then pulled out an old black and white photograph. It showed an aircraft from decades earlier. Sitting in the last row was the exact same man I had seen only hours ago. The officer quietly explained that the photograph had been taken in 1978, shortly before Flight 913 disappeared from radar with everyone on board. My hands started shaking as I stared at the photo. "That's impossible," I whispered. The detective nodded slowly and told me that every few years, someone on a flight carrying the number 913 claimed to see a mysterious last passenger dressed in black. The strange part was that airline records had never listed anyone matching his description. According to official documents, he had never purchased a ticket, passed through security, or boarded any aircraft. Yet witnesses from different decades all described the exact same man, wearing the exact same clothes, with the exact same expression. Months passed, and I tried convincing myself it had all been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Life slowly returned to normal until one evening I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was the photograph the detective had shown me. This time, however, something had changed. In the original picture, the mysterious man had been sitting alone in the last row. Now there were 2 people. The second person sitting beside him was me. I turned the photograph over and found a handwritten message on the back. "Next time you won't leave." I immediately contacted the airline, but they insisted there had never been a Flight 913 on the date I described. My boarding pass had vanished. My online booking history was gone. Even my bank statement showed no purchase for the ticket. Friends I had called from the airport claimed I had never mentioned traveling. It was as though the entire journey had been erased from reality. The only proof left was the old photograph resting on my kitchen table, showing me sitting beside a man who officially never existed. Last night I woke suddenly at exactly 3:13 a.m. to the sound of a boarding announcement echoing faintly through my bedroom. My phone screen lit up by itself with a digital boarding pass. Flight number 913, departure gate unknown, seat assignment 34E. Beneath it, one final message slowly appeared letter by letter. "Your traveling companion is already waiting. Then, somewhere inside my dark house, I heard the unmistakable sound of an airplane seat clicking into the upright position, followed by slow footsteps walking toward my bedroom door.